Okay. Okay, so it'll send me a tape of some kind afterwards. I'm not an expert on it. Okay. You could be the lead. I don't have any hang-ups about it, but I'm going to look foolish at certain times, but that's fine. And
I think we all are relative to the future.
But tell me, how long are we going to talk for? Half an hour?
As you like. I'm quite relaxed. So
okay.
I think we can go as long as the conversation wants to go. I can do an hour. I can do half an hour.
Okay, fine, good. So, yeah, so you started in your very interesting kind of recorded message, which I received. The investing is nature is not the problem, but how we invest in nature. And my response, that was the first kind of yes, but, because I think that how we invest in nature is shaped by how we think about nature and how we relate to nature. And that's where we've kind of got to, is that there's a group of people say we cannot just let things rip for any longer. We've got to do something. We have to invest in good things. And I have, until rather recently, thought you can't invest wisely or at all unless we change our attitude to what nature is and our relationship to it. So do you think those two worlds are converging?
I think they're converging, but they are starting from different positions. I think that's where the challenge, I think, really starts for me, which is that I think we must recognize that currently nature is undervalued. And the implications of the lack of value of nature is that urban trees get chopped down after 10 years because all the social or environmental value of the trees is not accounted for, where the maintenance and the insurance costs are. So the liabilities are understood and the public benefits are not understood. And that makes an incentive that trees are basically ornaments drawn by architects without actually being understood as biologically essential systems. So I think there's the accounting model, and that can be applied to soil. So soil health is not a valued thing. So our accounting mechanisms don't understand and compute the value of soil, which we are degrading significantly. So I think this applies to everything. Now, I think and I think this is where, so first thing is the non-valuing in nature, and that applies at nested formats. So the Amazon rainforest, we are all beneficiaries of that rainforest, yet the local citizens are, in order to survive, make local ecological business models called farming. So because the kind of differential values, whether it's local, intermediate, bioregional, and global value isn't computed, you have an incentive system which drives people to destroy global value in place of local specific value. And that means that the misaccounting of nature and the lack of accounting of nature is problematic in the incentive systems it sets up in the capital world. And that's where I kind of start. That's where one of the problems lies. And I can carry on going. Another example, maybe just for one major city in Europe is looking at a €1.5 billion sewer for rainwater. And you can provide a sewer where you can provide 600 odd micro-urban forests, which would actually remove the need for the sewer. Now the sewer, unfortunately, will sit on the balance sheet of the local authority, where the forests don't. They sit as liabilities. So our accounting mechanisms preference the building of sewers rather than urban forests, because we haven't engineered the accounting preference models or the incentive structures the right way. So I think there is a fundamental question of our incentives with nature. And then the final point I would make and hand over is that there is significant, to build those 643 forests requires resources. Requires human resources, capital resources, nurturing, maintenance costs, stewardship costs. So there's an understanding of that we need resource allocation to nature, definitely, to shift us from a declining position where actually our natural base system is in degenerative behaviors. We need to massively regenerate it. So there's resource allocation that is required. There's a misaccounting that's a real problem.
So I think that Mike, I go rewind a bit to the beginning called nature is undervalued. I think that it's just obviously true. My question is, there are a lot of people who think nature is the meaning of life, never mind just valuable, and who are very scared and critical of what happens when valuation is turned into an abstract form to do with, for example, money. Because as soon as the nature is turned into an asset that is owned by somebody or even owned by everybody, the kind of in what appears to be the logic of capital is to sweat the resources, to increase the productivity of that asset or to grow it, because otherwise it wouldn't be doing its job. So my starting point would be, are there ways of valuing an asset that do not have built into them the necessity for that asset to be sweated and to grow and to be transformed?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple positions into this, and this we really need. I really appreciate the framing. So there's multiple levels. One is, I'm not really a big fan of valuing the tree and putting a valuation of trees, and the reason is that every tree, its value is a function of its location. It's not a function of abstract universal value. Every tree is not the same. You couldn't plant the same tree in every location, and its value is not the same. So, and its value, not its price, its value is not the same. And so I think firstly, we must recognize that actually, if we want to take this approach, I'm not a big fan of valuing trees or universal models. Second thing is, you can say, well, okay, you can value the environmental services or the environmental benefits. You can say, okay, we'll value carbon. Now, the problem with single point valuations, like money, they will distort and destroy secondary and tertiary value. So if you reduce the value of a forest to timber, you optimize it for timber production and you destroy it for biodiversity, you destroy it for carbon sinks, all sorts of other secondary effects that are vital to human life. Now, that vital integrity, so I would say the value of every biological, say an urban forest, is almost like it goes to infinite value over time, in a way. I would say it's sort of now the question there becomes is, are we valuing the environmental services? Are we valuing the tree? Or are we valuing it against the liabilities that we currently hold, rainwater sewers, and doing an offset of saying we're going to value how 640 urban forests would offset it. But it also needs to be co-beneficiary. This is, I think, one of the key mistakes of, I think, modern capital is that it's been single point optimizing. It optimizes towards the return of capital. Now, and that means that you get exactly what you're saying, John. It gets the acceleration of a capital-centric model, financial-centric, capital-centric model. However, carbon and capital optimizing is a two-point optimizing. When you put carbon, capital, water retention, human microbiome, mental health, if you can start to look at the multiple co-beneficiaries, and this is, I think, the key thing, we need multiple co-beneficiaries, then you can start to actually take a different approach. And I think this fundamentally, we need to go from single point optimizing to multi-point optimizing, and that does require a governance shift. So I think our governance can't be structured through the holders of capital. So point of view of capital, the governance has to be locational, point of view of location, and multiple beneficiaries that those assets provide. And the role of capital is to support those multiple beneficiaries in that process.
So I think that one immediately can see promise in that notion, because this is where the bioregioning movement, if you can call it that, for 30 or 40 years has had this, the prospect of place-based aggregations of different parties with different interests, capital, farmers, activists, whatever. It's just that in the times when it's kind of been experimented with, the capital kind of logic has been much stronger than any of the other logics that are there. So I can imagine what you call it, territorial-based or location-based ownership. Do there exist examples that you can point to of where this is working?
So I think for me, this is a slight step-by-step approach. We know that rivers have been made self-sovereign in New Zealand and other parts. So we know this idea of nature being made self-sovereign and self-owning is coming. And I think that's a key part of the governance theory of this. The second part is that we now know and we can measure and compute additionalities driven by how we maintain and look after nature on multiple points of view. We can look at its water benefits, we can look at its multiplicity of benefits. Now, what I'm interested in is looking at those multiplicities, so water purification. So let's use heat. So it's sort of simple one. Increasing the canopy cover of a city like Madrid will mean that effectively that heat island effect in Madrid, which I think might be between 3.5 to 4.5 to 5 degrees as climate change accelerates, which is massive, by the way, will have huge impacts on heat stress for people, people's lives, unrelated deaths. We've had, people who have been, this is a real story in Madrid where people couldn't sleep at night. This gentleman got up, took a car in the morning, fell asleep in his car, and unfortunately passed away in a crash. So when you start to look at the effects that are happening, the heat island effects, that's just one aspect. Then you could have productivity losses of society itself. We know every 1 degree of temperature massively changes our cognitive capabilities. Then you could also look at all sorts of secondary effects in terms of actually socialization, resilience effects, all sorts of secondary effects if you wanted to. Now, if you start to value those health effects to human nature, you start to say, okay, these increasing the urban canopy is not just about the urban canopy, it's about these social environmental effects. I would put forth that valuing those effects is an alternative to treating those effects or to mitigating those effects with air conditioning. So with energy. So for me, there are two models. You can either say, right, we're going to increase our energy capacity of Madrid, and we're going to actually support air conditioning to happen universally. And we're going to use that as a mechanism to offset that, or we can plant trees. So it's a Capex replacement. So for me, that's just one model, right? So we also know Madrid has been facing flash floods and other things. Yes, sorry, John.
No, but that's exactly when you say Capex replacement. This is why this notion of infrastructure is so central to my question. It's like replacing the need to build things, which is another way to think about it. If you have lots of small urban parks, that is a wonderful proposition. But the capital system is looking all over the place for things to build, because that's the simplest way that it can do its job. And that, the real estate, the building industry, the civil engineering, we know that is a kind of core part of most modern economies. So yes, one can say, look, here's a much better alternative. We'll have a sort of lower cost urban parks. I mean, depaving is like 1/100th of the cost of building a new road, for example. And so that, but with all the benefits that you're describing, I just want to go back. How do you then stop the owners of capital saying, we're not going to build, persuade them or force them or incentivize them not to build things, but to finance 1,000 small forests?
Well, so 1,000 small, I think it's actually in capital's interest. So if it costs $1.5 billion to build a sewer, and it costs $638 million to build those forests, it's a pretty efficient allocation of capital to go, we're not going to build a sewer, we're going to build the forests. And actually, if we look at the value that the forest creates, there's a multiplicity of values where the sewer only really creates one form of value and one form of risk mitigation. So I think there's an economics in there that is self-telling that we don't, in a way, we're optimizing capital. we're actually making it optimized because we're valuing the multiplicity of it. And that, for me, the real challenge isn't, and I think you've got a really important point here, the real challenge isn't the capital owners. The real challenge is most infrastructure happens through a Keynesian thesis, and usually happens at the moment of crisis. So people go, right, if we build a sewer, how many jobs are we going to create? Right? Short-term, capital-focused jobs. As opposed to, what is the, and that means that what you end up doing is optimizing infrastructure for massive job creation. And that goes exactly as you're saying. It's a lot more. It's a lot less capital intensive. So 50% reduction in capital intensity doesn't actually do the effect that the political framework of capital wants to do in usually Keynesian theories.
Totally. So that therefore you could say we're going to build a highway system or some dams, and all these jobs will be created and companies will be made to prosper. Whereas the system of, the investors and the governments and the officials
and it's
planning
investors.
system.
It's not investors, John. It's actually politics of this. And this is, I think, really difficult because I think the Keynesian value framework is not for capital. The Keynesian value framework is a perceived theory of how we use infrastructure to reboot our economies. Now, I would argue that if you put the money into trees, you still have a stewardship component, which is significant, which actually does exactly what you're saying. It creates longitudinal jobs and it creates longitudinal value. But we have to build those calculations to be able to offset what is a simple Keynesian and sort of pass through. And it's also the pass through money. You build a house, the money passes through to the real economy very quickly. So people are using this as the speed of velocity, the velocity of how money passes through into economy. This is where I think there's a really important issue here of how we see trees as infrastructure requires us to reimagine the Keynesian effects of trees as infrastructure in a systemic way, in a new way. But that's a really good point, John.
Because I saw somebody talking about the fact that the ecological restoration in the United States employs more people than steel, coal mining and logging, certainly in the kind of so-called Rust Belt states. And I thought that was an extraordinary piece of information. I haven't been able to confirm it, but that basically is what a traditional political answer would be to, for example, a decommissioning a coal region. We are going to create more or better jobs doing the restoration than you're doing now as miners. It's just that I don't think that many government systems or officials know how to do the second bit. So there's that kind of institutional lag between what sounds very beautiful and green, such as restoring things is better than digging things up, but they don't know how to implement it and they don't have the structures. Am I right? That's my impression.
You're absolutely right. This works at many levels. The accounting model doesn't account for it. So many of the things that we're talking for are not accounted for. Even trees as infrastructure largely will have to operate in the voluntary carbon market. So the accounting infrastructure doesn't construct it. You're absolutely right. Why we called it trees as infrastructure was to make the case we have to see this thing as an infrastructure provision as opposed to a project provision. And that means your financial models have to be linked into the kind of almost a Keynesian logic that's underpinned, I think, our recession boom cycle. And that means building the evidence, building the proof cases of that. That means also being able to look at the additionalities that are generated through co-beneficiary effects. So, for example, health systems, though they're doing it, like NHS is investing in green spaces because they recognize it as an offset, but it's not a systemic function. It's what I would call a marginal good person function, as opposed to being, oh, this is our liabilities into the future. If we reinvested into green infrastructure, shared great green infrastructure, this would be the benefits.
So you say it's like there's an accounting aspect, and that's why you call this infrastructure, because somebody knows how to do the numbers for an infrastructure project, which presumably has a longer time frame, and that answers the question of short term and versus long term. Okay. But in terms of physically organizing a nation's resources or a city's resources, is that an obstacle as well? I mean, does Madrid, for example, know how to plant X number of trees in the right way with the right knowledge involved?
I think there is, so again, this is all about incentives. So look, we have underfunded our green infrastructure maintenance massively. So largely, most of our green infrastructure in the UK is not really optimized for the multiple benefits. It's really optimized for grass, which is a pretty shitty piece of infrastructure. So there is a cultural and structural transition. Now, I think there's some really extraordinary people, virtually in every city, who understand this. I don't think this is something that isn't understood. I think the real issue is the understanding. So, for example, the value of maintenance. So trees are not like cars. They are generative systems. That means that year on year, their carbon sequestration capability grows. Year on year, their water sequestration capability grows. Year on year, their impacts, if you plant them right, impacts on pollen can be reduced if you plant male and female trees. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens as a result of that. The reality is that our current models don't appreciate any of that generative value, but that requires stewardship. You have to be able to steward those environments and look after them, because unless you don't, it's very easy for these trees to be carbon positive as opposed to carbon sequestration. It's very easy for the water benefits not to be there. We don't know how to pay for that stewardship problem, which is, I think, is all about the additionality. How do you link that additionality of value back to the continuous maintenance and stewardship of those trees? And that's a key part of that story.
So I can see there's a kind of process, and you keep reminding me that you're starting at certain sort of doable moments rather than doing the whole picture in one go. But just for my benefit, if you build a railway system, then all the kind of criteria for its success from the beginning until its operations are efficiency, quantity, and scale of the investment involved. But those words don't apply to biodiversity or natural systems. Well, not for the most part, they don't. So nature is infinitely diverse. It grows and it evolves at different speeds over very long periods. And in general, scale is not a virtue in a living system. So how do you so you could call trees or infrastructure, good. The accountants can kind of get their heads around that. But then you have all these other ways of managing and controlling investments that are also not yet fit for purpose.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. So once you've got rid of the trees and infrastructure, you sort of said, this is the idea frame, then you have to reimagine infrastructure in a generative lens. And infrastructure in a generative lens means that you have to sort of say, actually, we're not talking about just this is the value of a tree and that's what it's going to be over 50 years. We're going to talk about it as a generative function, which looks at the year-on-year additionality by stewardship. So you have a human ecological relationship and you value that generative component as opposed to seeing it as a static component. So that means that your contractual frame has to be focused on being a computational contract, which is generative, as opposed to a static analog fixed frame contract of value. That also means your financial model is linked not onto a single point, sort of single capital allocation, but is a facility which is generatively evolving. So imagine this as a dynamic competitionally assisted ecological rebalancing. And they're both the money and the value and the price, or how we want, is in a dynamic equilibrium, as opposed to being in a static, linear project and play equilibrium. And that to me is the real revolution that's now possible, that wasn't possible before.
So does the word productivity enter the narrative in this bit of the story with trees as infrastructure? Is a tree-based infrastructure productive in a traditional sense of the word? Because regenerative and productive, to me, there's a conflict there, but I haven't got my head around it.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, if a tree reduces your healthcare costs, or urban forest reduces your healthcare costs, it adds to the economic productivity of your city, because actually humans are less unwell. You could say if an urban forest reduces the flooding risk of your city, because effectively sustainable urban sequestration, it means that there are assets which are less at risk. So it's a kind of mutual insurance model. So if the microbiome quality of urban forests improve our human health and our resilience, that can be massively significant too. So I think this is infrastructure. It spills over for human social productivity. And I hate the term productivity because it's effectively linked to a labor theory of value. But if I wanted to plug into that landscape, that's how I'd plug into it. But I would say that we're moving into a different age anyway, where productivity has to be replaced. Productivity is a preconception of value, whereas creativity, care, craft, complex cognition is about not extrinsically driven ideas of value, but creating the intrinsic pathway for value discovery, which is a completely different type of mindset of human value. But so that's a problem with the word productivity in my view. But if I was
I'd be very reassured if you could tell me that we're not going to use it anymore in the future, because it's a horrible word which everybody regards as necessary to get anybody to invest in anything. That the productivity of this factory or this road or this railway system or this hospital will be
So I think infrastructure sits in a different category to factories.
Right. Okay.
So productivity is typically associated to factories. Now, I think that's, for me, the problem with productivity is it's still preconceived on the theory of what is the perceived value. So you preconceive the value and you assign the productivity, and then everyone else is a cog to achieve that productivity target. And that preconception of value, I think, is virtually impossible in a complex emergent world, and is actually probably not the key role of humans. I think productivity could be assigned to machine systems because they are machined linear systems, whereas human systems need to be reimagined to not be extrinsically productive, but to create the conditions for intrinsic explorations and discovery value, and intrinsic orders of value discovery rather than extrinsically controlled theories of value. Because humans, I think key human contribution will be care, creativity, complex cognition, craft, which are all iterative functions and discovery functions and in relational functions, as opposed to extrinsically defined productivity functions. Now, what you can do, John, one thing I will say is that population level effects can be conceived. So you can conceive what would happen if we change our relationship with nature to make it one of care as opposed to one of transactions. And I think transaction or human relationships to nature, which are transaction orientated, are based on an old world thesis of trying to single point optimize. Whereas when you recognize a tree is not the value of timber, but is a value of multiple other things, your relationship with that ecological system or that thing in its broadest sense becomes a thing of care because you don't know the secondary effects. So I think there's a deeper transformation of our relationship with things in a complex emergent world, but that changes ideas of productivity, that changes ideas of the nature of our relationship with the world and further on.
So I'm hoping we can, good. I thought I'd mention that word because it always comes along to bug me. The word care to me seems to be the most dynamic word we've mentioned so far. I was just reading David Bollier, you may know his work, he's doing a book about relational finance, where he talks about organizing ways to finance the infrastructure needed for people to be able to care for each other. That is to say, human to human care. But when I hear you talking about caring for the trees in a city, for example, or for the parks or for the rivers or anything else, that just begins to set light bulbs off in my head, because there are people trying to understand what a caring city would be, where it's about, you know, people caring for people. But if you had people caring for people and caring for trees, so to speak, as part of the same envelope of activities, that would, I think, just transform our expectations of the value of what's being discussed.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the work, there's some work that we did on civic AI, which is how do you use machine systems to not create transaction architectures of money, but relationship assistance, right? So we can use technology to create infrastructures of care rather than just infrastructures of financial optimization. And I think that's, so I just bring that in. And the second part I think is that I think is important. If we talk about a human relational economy of care or society of care, and you can flip that either way, is that I think what it starts to talk about is population level effects. And this is something that we're sort of, why I think landscape level financing and population level financing is critical is because you're not trying to monetize it at the level of every unitary transaction. You're not trying to say, oh, you've cared for this tree, here's £2.50. Thank you very much. Actually, what you're trying to say is, well, actually, people care for the trees and they get the benefits of all the other benefits that are coming in. So your financial system might sit at a macro level, at the population level, without having to create a transactional landscape of monetization at the level of every transaction. So how do we create a macro level financial economy and a day-to-day behavioral economy of gifts? I think these become really important theses. And for me, the macro level monetization is not about, you know, people often talk about, you know, why are we monetizing? For me, the only real big reason to use money, financial value, is to be able to understand allocation of value. Where are you going to allocate resource? It's an allocation theory which goes outside, which is fractal to the point of need, as opposed to centralized through a government thesis, which actually is one of the kind of challenges.
Well, this is another big, difficult question for me, but I don't know if you know Gabriele Winkel's work in Germany, the care revolution, where she's looking at the different infrastructures that could be used but don't yet exist for collaborative care, social care. Maybe you talk about population level care, I'm not sure. But the big debate there is, does financializing, even if it's not a transaction, supposing it's an infrastructure but it's paid for, does that in some way diminish the social energy that runs these things at the moment? So that, you know, for 50 years, people have talked about the care economy as being outside the financial economy, but part of its vitality and durability has come from that exact fact that it's based on social trust and it's embodied and local, you know, culture-based, but also place-based. Is what you're describing a danger to the, so to speak, the unfinancialized bit of the care world at the moment?
So I think we've run out of road space, metaphorically, on that care economy. So the demographics of Europe at a macro level, all the way through to actually the nature of our society in terms of the time poverty that we've generated asymmetrically across society. I think the idea that without radical transformation in our infrastructures of care, that we're going to be able to smoothly make some form of care economy, I think is problematic. Now, I think there are really radical ways to think about the care economy and non-monetize it. I think if you do monetize at the transaction level care economy, it reduces the theory of care. And it reduces it even how you manage it. So I think the NHS in its management model has basically, whilst it's free at the point of care, has created an architecture of governance which is driven through financial optimization, which I think destroys the economy of care. So, and it has huge externalities and overheads for control buried into it. So I think we have to start to think about this, not only from how do you build an economy of care, but then an economy of learning as opposed to an economy of control. And then you have to talk about how do we invest collectively, society, into building those shared infrastructures. And that resource allocation is real. So I do think that I think it requires very careful design. I don't think it's just about non-transactions. Like I say, I think if you keep it non-transactions, but mechanisms, your management theory is still a management theory of control, which is what most management theory is. I don't think you get into those realities. So I think you're right to point out, I think we can talk about it at experiential level, but I think this is a system level transformation to take it all the way through. Now, it doesn't get rid of money everywhere, but I think it can allow for a new relationship between the two.
So it depends. This is where I get nervous about the word system, because the word system sort of denotes to me, I know not everybody means it, a slightly kind of placeless thing that envelops, you know, the large areas of the world or large populations. Whereas there are people who say that you cannot systematize a place-based culture of care because it's rooted in its place, and in the same way that biodiversity is impossible to kind of measure its complexity, the same goes for care in a place where people have all sorts of bonds and behaviors and forms of trust that you can't measure them, and therefore you can't in some way systematize them, which is partly me not understanding what you mean by the word system. But for example, let's say Mancini's writing a book about proximity, a kind of geographical place-based notion of a city that is caring, where it's just physical proximity is a precondition. That's not, I don't think, the same thing as a system, but correct me if I'm wrong. But in other words, that if we try and have a global care system, we're going to be defeated before we start. But if we look at the conditions place by place for care to thrive, then that we can see signals of success. So
I think, again, this is a beautifully nuanced conversation, because I think at multiple levels. So I think you can create the conditions for care to exist. And that's what I would say is sort of, so for example, you can design houses which are miles apart from each other with no social frontage, and you will bias the system or bias the conditions to be less caring. They won't be not caring, because there could be one amazing person in there who makes toffee for everyone, who brings everyone together. Like, it won't be, this is where I think it becomes really important. Conditions create biases for particular types of outcomes, but they aren't totalitarian. They're not predictive. They're probabilistic systems. They create probabilistic biases. So if you want to go towards a system which is, so the conditions which are towards biasing towards care, you have to create some form of social solidarity to recognize that the care is both, for some people, valuable. For some people, it's a source of tyranny. So because it's not the care that's a tyranny, but the flip side of care is nosy neighbors who are homogeneous in their thinking, who don't like other people, right? Whatever the other is. So that social solidarity. Now, this is where how we build bridging social capital infrastructure versus bonding social capital infrastructure is a subtle bias of the infrastructure and the typology of care that we build. This is why I don't typically use words like community. I worked out to be in community, to be in commoning is much better to be in community. Because community creates an othering landscape. So I think there's very subtle nuances of context driving bias in how systems operate and relationships operate. These are probabilistic systems, not mechanistic systems. Then there is a whole bunch of sort of being careful of the flip side of these models as well. So how do you build bridging capital oriented care, which is all about nodability, which is all about all sorts of softer levels of bounding, which actually create openness in the system. So openness in how we live our lives. And then I think there are compromises that you make in different stages of your life. So at certain stages of your life, your ability to, your self-belief in your own sovereignty or your own agency may be very high because you may be earning a lot of money, resources, and at certain points you recognize your interdependence in various periods. So I think, again, that requires building shared language and shared comprehensions of these different phases of life in those models. So I agree. I suppose, and the reason why I like Enzo's book on proximity is, for me, proximity is not only to do with place.
No.
Proximity is a relational idea that can be constructed through our supply chains, create a proximus relationship between our food systems, our food farming environments, and what we eat. But we're currently deproximatized. So how do you construct this wider theory of proximity is really important in an entangled global world. I don't know if that starts to get into those questions.
No, it does, but it loops back to this question of what is an infrastructure for care, whether it's for trees or for each other in a city, because the word denotes, when you mention we should have houses that are close to each other, for example, as an idea. In general, supposing for the sake of argument, we're not going to be building vast amounts of social housing or collective villages, that's not except for a tiny minority. We're going to be dealing with the infrastructure that we've already got. Therefore, infrastructure is ways of reconfiguring existing, for example, buildings, as well as services. And so that comes back, will anybody be happy to pay for reconfiguring existing buildings or existing services in the cause of care? Is anybody going to be motivated to do that?
So I think that's so there's probably two questions I want to answer there. One is, what do we think about infrastructure? So I think increasingly, when you're looking at population level impacts that are wide scale, whole population level effects, then so you can look at it through what you impact, whole populations. You can look at two typologies, which is, so trees as infrastructure is a novel idea of infrastructure. It's non-traditional. It's not roads. It's not fixed. You can look at whole city retrofit. So I would argue that being able to retrofit a whole city is a form of infrastructure creation, because of the entangled value and a whole population level effects that it creates is that. And then you can talk about mental health being a 21st century infrastructure of society, the collective mental health of a city, which is an intangible infrastructure of a city. So we have tangible assets and intangible assets. And I think similarly, we have intangible infrastructures and tangible. Now, the mental health of a city is an emergent intangible function of lots of other investments. But but if you build it, the collective mental health is a piece of infrastructure because it creates capacity in a way that didn't exist before at a societal level, at population level. So we're reframing infrastructures through that lens. Now, the second point you make about the doing the infill and making it more caring, I think you could. So here's a sort of way to make a sort of playful business model. If on one hand you priced adequately the infrastructure liabilities of those roads and those sewers, to say, if we have to build new roads and sewers, the long-term maintenance of these roads and sewers is going to cost this much. You would have a very quick incentive for densification of those infrastructures, first provision. Second thing is you say, if our care budget, because of social isolation, is going to accelerate by this much function, and by doing strategic infill, we're infill not just for housing, but infill as a piece of care infrastructure, how we design this housing, how we involve people in the design of the housing, the material impacts it has, and if we can reduce the long-term care liabilities, then you start to have a different business model. If you then say, actually, if we put a price on embodied carbon and embodied materials and throwing them to waste, actually we start to put a price, a value on retrofitting those buildings, because actually knocking them down suddenly has a liability. So I think these are, and this is what I would call these system business models, and this is a lot of the work that we've been doing, is not just looking at the unitary value of the house and its sale value and its rental value, but taking a full system view of its value. I think you can construct these arguments. Now, then, if you construct that argument at a whole city level, you would say that that is a piece of infrastructure because you're building the care capacity of the whole city, and you're also building all sorts of reducing liabilities into existing costs, like roads, infrastructures, improving the maintenance capability of them. So I think there's a way to think about this stuff in a completely different way that answers that question.
So I think that my ears prick up on it. You make the argument and they say, yes, we agree with your argument. Now what do we do? And that's where what Bolia talks about, commons-based vessels of value creation, because lots of people have said to me, well, Uber Eats is a new form of infrastructure, very lightweight. It just so happens to be extractive and exploitive, but at the end, it's still a new infrastructure. So how you get a new infrastructure which is adding to the social and ecological health of a place rather than diminishing it, that I think is the crucial step. And what you said a while back about nature itself being one of the stakeholders, if that's something that we can put on the table, this is a natural part of the story. So this river is going to be part of our discussions about the infrastructure of Madrid, for example. If that can be put on the table, I think that's where you start.
I don't even think it's an if problem, John. I think we have to do it. I think the ideal self-sovereignty of nature and recognizing the river has its own self-sovereignty, and I think is a fundamental part. We're doing some work on self-sovereign of a house owning itself for public good.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Right? And that's literally based on doing this exact problem, which is that currently housing is extracted from, so you buy a house, you sell it 5 years later, you extract the equity value, you drive the inflation of that value, so the next person has to borrow even more. And there's this sort of extractive value that is generated. Now, if, community land trusts have been trying to solve this problem in different ways, they end up creating value for 50 years, and then some bunch of community landowners come together and say, oh, you know what, we can sell our directorships in this housing and we'll make a lot of money, which has happened, right? So, so the reality is that we need a new way of holding nature or common goods in a communal framework. And this is where, so this infrastructure stuff that we're talking about, that's why I don't want to put a value on nature. I don't think these things should own nature. I don't think that nature should be self-sovereign in that framework. So I think you're absolutely right that we have to reimagine our theory of governance. So we just wrote a paper called Radical Civics, which is literally just saying everything needs to be perceived as almost being a civic agent in society. So the house, the forest, these are all civic agents, and that means that they're optimizing for multiple benefits, and they're optimizing for multiple benefits in space and time. And their relationship is not to optimize towards us, but to be continuously commonly optimizing. from a location-centric point of view.
One of the things you said in your sort of spoken reply to my talk was the importance of language. And I think that I agree with you, but I just find language is like going over the highest fence in a steeplechase every day, because there are so many words which are confusing to people or are unclear, and where the kind of leveraging and gaming of words is almost part of what the greenwashing industry does. I mean, do you have an answer to that question? Well, yes, we need to speak clearly, but as soon as we speak clearly or use common language, somebody will then take a word and distort it or twist it. Is there a material answer? It's not just in our heads, but in people's daily material realities. How do we instantiate some of these ideas?
So, firstly, I really appreciate the question. I mean, I have to say that why I said language was important is words like assets, words like commodity, words like financialization, securitization. These are all based on a way of seeing the world, which is through an object-oriented worldview. It is not a worldview which is based on becoming, or where we see the world through a verb-centric perspective. That's almost a foundational question of how we as a society have evolved to becoming more object-orientated. And I think that's been a 400-year journey through Newtonian logics and everything else. And we've seen the nounization of our language. And that nounization is manifested into our financial landscape. And the concepts have all been about concretizing the object. Whereas if we want to, and this is why I mean language is important, is I think as part of the journey to building trees as infrastructure, I think we have to reimagine slowly the taxonomy of the language that we're using, and to actually deeply recode this stuff. Because if we keep using the word asset, we'll psychologically default back into all the object-oriented optimization models, and it will destroy our innovation landscape to be able to really deeply innovate around the landscape, what's necessary. So that's why I was saying that language is a really important endeavor right now, because I think we're in a language shift. We are living in an age where our language is going to have to go from being object and noun orientated to being process and verb orientated. And that is going to be critical in re-engineering everything around us in a new way.
So I think I agree with you, but I would make this is where my yes, and maybe we can draw to a close on this. I think that language is of great importance, but that it's so kind of easily twisted and clouded by the kind of desert of the real that we all live in, with all the competing signals of one sort or another. We need to find and look for ways in which the word and experience are connected in our bodies as well as in our minds. So that if you say asset, it cannot be an abstract thing, because we have, an asset, that was when I was next to that tree, or I was in my food kitchen, or something that is kind of an embodied correlation to the word. I'm not putting it very clearly, but I just think that we need to have embodied understanding of the words will prevent people twisting them.
Absolutely. And I think that's why this has to be part of that we're broadening out, but I think this is why this has to be part of a cultural revolution. If we perceive ourselves as objects, if we perceive ourselves as linear, defined objects, then we see the world that way. So I think this is a cultural revolution, of embodied revolution of that language, but it has to almost start with reimagining ourselves as humans in that relationship story. If we see ourselves as meritocratic, object-orientated, defined systems, not recognizing that pretty much everything I've said is probably 99.9% built off the knowledge of other people, not my own capabilities. I think you start to misconfigure yourself. So I think the embodied experience is critical. I do think you're absolutely right that language is being subverted, but I think that's the war that we're in the middle of. The war is actually about, the lock-ins wanting to preserve the current system, and actually us having to change the current system. And the incumbents want to lock us in to old ideologies and old frameworks, because that's where their value is currently locked in. So we are in a linguistic war, and it's not just linguistic, it's ways of seeing war. And we're right now in the middle of it. And I think you could even argue really openly that the word infrastructure is part of the problem in that language. I don't think infrastructure is the end. I think what we want to use infrastructure for tactically is a bridging word for population level effects. But actually, there's a new word that needs to be found, infrastructuring or some other verb-oriented word that needs to be reimagined later on. And I think that's going to be critical to allowing us to reconceptualize infrastructure in a deep way. But we need bridging language and then pivoting language and evolutionary pathways.
And bridging experiences to kind of lock the new understanding in place.
Exactly.
What do you think about pausing at this point? I think it's quite fascinating, and we can talk all day, but I just, yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, real pleasure. Thank you for reaching out, John. And
no, well, thank you for this work, and I'm just learning so much. So I will now go back and learn some more and read some of the documentation. And yeah, there's so many points where we're sort of converging and then learning new questions. So I think that's very healthy. So thank you.
And also, I don't sit here with any premise that we know this stuff. Like I think this is an act of discovery, and it's an act of nuance. I don't sit here saying this is the truth. I think there's probably loads of errors in what we're thinking, and that will need to be discovered. And
I choose to believe that Mark Carney may think that he's got $130 trillion to spend, but he's filled with questions and doubts. Of course he is. And the people that are most assertive in how kind of clear the story is going forward are the ones that, yeah, they're not the ones that can be our guides, I think, at this point. So uncertainty is helpful.
Thank you, John.
Great, Indy, thank you. So
have a lovely break.
I'll do something with this recording, and we'll share it with you in some way. And then, yeah, this is fantastic. Let's meet again, and have a
Absolutely, real pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, nice to see you.
Likewise. Bye.